Welcome back to Red Fence, where we cut through the noise, follow the facts, and examine the stories that matter. I'm your host, ABH, and today we're diving deep into one of the most polarizing criminal cases to emerge from Texas in recent memory: the conviction of Karmelo Anthony for the killing of Austin Metcalf. This case has generated over 213 news stories in the past 3 months alone. It's drawn in politicians, activists, legal experts, and grieving families. And depending on which outlet you read, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were following two completely different stories. So today we're going to break it all down to facts of the case, the courtroom drama, the post-trial legal battles, the activist response, and critically, how the media has chosen to frame every step of it. Let's get into it. First, let's establish who Karmelo Anthony is and why this case has captured so much national attention. Anthony was a teenager at the time of the incident, a fact that has been central to how different sides of the political and media spectrum have framed this story. His age, his background, and the circumstances surrounding the killing of Austin Metcalf all became flashpoints in a broader national conversation about race, self-defense, juvenile justice, and accountability. The case didn't just become a legal matter. It became a cultural and political one almost immediately. That's a significant detail to keep in mind as we work through everything that followed. Why does it matter? Because the Karmelo Anthony case sits at the intersection of several fault lines in American public life right now: criminal justice reform, media bias, political opportunism, and the grief of a family who lost a son. Each of those threads deserves careful examination. So what actually happened? Austin Metcalf was a young man killed in Texas, a death that by any measure was a tragedy. The facts of the killing, as established through the prosecution's case, pointed to Karmelo Anthony as the responsible party. The jury agreed. Now, it's important here to separate what the trial established from what the post-trial noise has tried to relitigate. The jury heard the evidence. They returned a verdict. That is the factual baseline. But how we got to trial and what happened during it is where the story gets considerably more complex. The relationship between Anthony and Metcalf, the circumstances leading up to the killing, and the nature of the confrontation were all vigorously contested. Defense attorneys argued one set of facts. The prosecution argued another, and the jury, after deliberation, sided with the state. Austin Metcalf was someone's son and someone's friend. That reality should never get lost in the legal and political machinery that has since consumed this case. His father has made sure of that. But we'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about the trial itself, because there are details here that have become central to the post-conviction controversy. Perhaps the most discussed procedural moment was what's been described as a so-called gentleman's deal, an informal agreement that effectively kept Anthony off the witness stand. This is not unusual in criminal defense strategy. The Fifth Amendment right not to testify is fundamental. But in a case this high profile, the decision not to put the defendant on the stand became fodder for significant public debate. Those defending Anthony argued that testifying would have exposed him to aggressive cross-examination that could have overwhelmed the young defendant. Those critical of the decision, particularly commentators on the right, framed it as an evasion of accountability. What's the legal reality? Defense attorneys make calculated decisions about whether the risk of cross-examination outweighs the benefit of letting a jury hear their client's voice. That calculation is made in thousands of cases every year. It's standard practice, but in a politically charged case, standard practice rarely stays standard. The trial also featured moments that Anthony's defense team would later cite in their motion for a new trial, claims that the presiding judge exhibited bias that prejudiced their client's ability to receive a fair hearing. That's a serious allegation, and it's one that the courts are now being asked to evaluate. When the verdict came in, the reaction was swift, and it split almost entirely along political lines. Right-leaning politicians and media figures largely framed the conviction as justice served. Fox News covered it extensively. The New York Post ran prominent stories emphasizing the facts of the killing and the verdict. The message from that side of the spectrum was relatively consistent. A jury did its job. From the other direction, a very different narrative emerged. Activists and commentators pointed to Anthony's age, raised questions about the fairness of the trial, and in some cases positioned the case within a broader framework of systemic inequity in the American justice system. Here's what's worth noting. Both reactions reflect genuine values. The belief that violent crime must be met with accountability is a legitimate value. So is the belief that young people deserve equitable treatment in the justice system. The problem arises when either position ignores the specific facts of the specific case in favor of a pre-written narrative. And that, frankly, is what happened on both sides. Political figures weighed in. Some before the trial had concluded, some immediately after the verdict, and in doing so, they added pressure to a legal process that should, in theory, operate independently of political sentiment. The verdict was not the end of this story, not by a long shot. Anthony's legal team filed a motion for a new trial, a standard post-conviction legal mechanism, but one that carries real weight when the allegations are as serious as those raised here. The core claim? Judicial bias. The defense argued that the presiding judge's conduct during the trial rulings, demeanor, and specific decisions deprived Anthony of a fair proceeding. If that allegation is substantiated, it goes to the heart of due process. Courts take bias claims seriously, or at least they're supposed to. The appointment of a new judge to evaluate the motion is a significant development. It signals that someone in the judicial system believed the allegations warranted independent review rather than the original judge evaluating complaints about themselves. That's how the system is designed to work. But here's the critical question. Will the legal process be allowed to run its course, or will the ongoing political and media circus around this case continue to inject external pressure into a process that demands impartiality? The post-trial motions are still working their way through the system. No final determination has been made. That matters. It means the legal story here is genuinely unresolved. While the courts deliberate, the streets have not been quiet. Activists from Baton Rouge organized and marched in support of a retrial for Karmelo Anthony. The march drew attention, and predictably it drew competing interpretations. Supporters of the march argued it represented exactly what civic engagement should look like. Citizens expressing concern about the fairness of a judicial outcome through peaceful, visible protest. That is, by any measure, a constitutionally protected and historically validated form of expression. Critics predominantly from right-leaning media characterized the march as an attempt to intimidate the legal process, or as an example of activists rallying around a convicted killer. Some coverage used the protest as a launching pad to criticize broader criminal justice reform movements. What did the march actually accomplish? At minimum, it kept public pressure on the courts and on elected officials. Whether that pressure translates into meaningful legal outcomes remains to be seen. Marches don't overturn convictions. Courts do. But they do shape the public and political context in which legal decisions get made. Here is where we need to pause and talk about something that sometimes gets buried beneath the legal arguments and the political noise. Austin Metcalf is gone. He was a real person with a life ahead of him, and his father has responded to that loss with something remarkable. In the wake of his son's death and the subsequent trial, Austin's father launched a foundation in Austin's name. The details of the foundation's mission reflect what the family wants Austin to be remembered for. Not as a casualty in a political debate, but as a young man whose life had value and whose memory deserves to be honored constructively. That choice to build something in the face of grief rather than simply fuel the outrage machine deserves acknowledgement. Not every family in these circumstances chooses that path. Many would be forgiven for not doing so. The foundation also serves as a reminder to everyone consuming coverage of this case. There is a real family at the center of this. The legal battles, the political statements, the activist marches, they all orbit around a death that devastated people who loved Austin Metcalf. Now let's get analytical, because this is where ground news data becomes genuinely useful. 60% of coverage of the Karmelo Anthony case has come from right-leaning outlets. That's a significant skew. In 213 stories over 3 months, the dominant frame has been one that emphasizes the conviction, the nature of the crime, and skepticism toward post-trial claims of bias or unfair treatment. Outlets like Fox News and the New York Post have led that coverage. Their framing tends to center accountability, the victim's family, and the validity of the jury's verdict. Those are legitimate emphases. Left-leaning and centrist outlets have covered the story less frequently, but when they have, the framing tends to foreground Anthony's age, questions of systemic fairness, and the post-trial legal challenges. The Hindustan Times and Total Pro Sports represent some of the more internationally distributed or niche coverage, often focusing on the spectacle of the case rather than its legal or political substance. So what does that coverage disparity tell us? A few things. First, this story has become a cause for the right in a way it hasn't fully become for the left, at least not in terms of mainstream media volume. Second, the 60-40 split doesn't mean right-leaning outlets are wrong. And it doesn't mean left-leaning outlets are avoiding the story out of bad faith. It means different editorial priorities are producing different coverage profiles. Third, and this is the most important point, if you're only reading one side of this coverage, you are getting an incomplete picture. The facts of this case are complicated enough. They don't need to be further distorted by selective information consumption. So where does this go from here? The most immediate legal question is the outcome of the motion for a new trial. The new judge appointed to evaluate that motion will need to determine whether the claims of judicial bias have sufficient merit to warrant overturning the conviction and starting the process again. That is a high legal bar. Bias claims are made frequently, they succeed less often. If the motion is denied, Anthony's legal team will almost certainly appeal. This case has the profile and the resources given the public attention it has generated to climb through the appellate system for years. If, by some measure, the motion succeeds and a new trial is ordered, the entire evidentiary and procedural process begins again. A different judge, a different jury pool, and given how much media attention has already saturated this case, a serious challenge in finding jurors who haven't already formed opinions. Meanwhile, the political and activist pressure around this case is unlikely to diminish. High-profile cases rarely fade quietly. The foundation launched by Austin Metcalf's father will continue its work. The legal machinery will grind forward, and the media will continue to frame, reframe, and argue about what this case means for America. What this case actually means in terms of justice for both Austin Metcalf and Karmelo Anthony, in terms of what it reveals about the courts, the media, and the politics of criminal justice will be determined not by op-eds or marches or political statements. It will be determined by whether the legal system does what it is supposed to do. Apply the law fairly, without fear or favor, to the facts as they actually exist. That's the standard. Whether this case meets it is still an open question. That's it for today's episode of Red Fence. If this case is something you want to follow closely, Ground News is one of the better tools available for tracking how different outlets are covering the same story. The bias ratings and coverage comparisons give you context that a single outlet simply can't provide. As always, the goal here is not to tell you what to think. It's to give you the information and the framework to think clearly. On a case this charged, that matters more than ever. If you found value in today's episode, share it with someone who's been following this story. Leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, stay analytical, stay fair, and keep asking the hard questions.